Hello, I'm nahshondion, and you're watching TRANSBRATIONS. Today's special guest is Ron Kavanaugh. He's a literary activist and founding director of the Literary Freedom Project, a Bronx-based arts organization that believes cultural identity is a fundamental cornerstone in the development of smart, creative, and engaged communities. Born and raised in the Bronx, Kavanaugh has worked with numerous local arts organizations, including the Bronx Museum of the Art, Bronx Council on the Art, and En Foco. In 2017, he organized the photography exhibition, Black Documents, which featured photographer Jamel Shabazz. In 2022, Kavanaugh co-curated Swagger and Tenderness, the South Bronx Portraits by Ahearn and Rigoberto Torres at the Bronx Museum. And he also received the Madam C.J. Walker Award presented by the Hurston Wright Foundation. As executive director of the Literary Freedom Project, he oversees community-facing programs, One Book One Bronx, the Mosaic Literary Conference, and Mosaic Magazine. Hello, Ron. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. You have to forgive me. I think I'm having a Diana Ross moment today. So
It's all right. That's not a bad moment.
It's not a bad moment at all. I don't think I've had that many Diana Ross moments. So no, it's just that, with the weather, I was kind of prepared that it was going to be hot and sticky. I don't have AC. So this weather is perfect. It's cool. It's pretty cool.
It's a good day today.
It is. And so, yes, thank you for joining me. Where did you grow up in the Bronx?
I grew up in the Morrisania section on 163rd and Trinity Avenue, which is not far from, I don't know what landmarks are around there, but Morris High School is not far from there. Fat Joe made our street famous with Lean Back on Trinity Ave. So yeah, that's where I grew up at.
And Big Pun too, correct?
Big Pun, yeah, Big Pun.
I'm gonna read this. Ron recalled how growing up in Morrisania, he was always drawn to books. He used to frequent the local library and spent many hours there.
That's so true. My local branch was the Woodstock branch of the New York Public Library on 160th and like Forest Avenue, between Forest and Jackson, I believe. And it's one of the older branches in the New York Public Library system. And I can just remember going there, weekly when I was in elementary school, to take out new books, to research projects, to, besides the books, they also do public programs around movies and different things like that. So yeah, I went to the library weekly as a child.
So the new branch, Morrisania, which I occasionally go to sometimes, that branch is new. That's a newer branch.
So the Morrisania branch of the public library is a different branch. The branch that I'm referring to is called the Woodstock branch. Excuse me, I think I might have mixed that up earlier. But my local library growing up was called the Woodstock Library. Woodstock is actually a section in the Bronx, a neighborhood in the Bronx, but it's located in the Morrisania section of the Bronx. So it's kind of like confusing. There's a Woodstock branch that's located in Morrisania.
Okay, this is my first time hearing about that branch.
Yeah.
So I'll have to go and find it.
It's really small. It's actually, I think it's the second or third oldest building as part of the library system in New York.
What are your favorite aspects of the Bronx?
The cultural diversity. There are so many different nationalities here, languages here. I often find myself on the bus going either north or south on the Grand Concourse. And when you're on that bus, you'll hear people from Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Nigeria, Ghana, Albania. So it's just like a diversity of cultures here in the Bronx. And everybody sort of is like in tune with everyone's hustle. The Bronx is a place where people really hustle, whether it is work, whether it's what you do for fun. I always feel like everyone is connected that way, and that sort of breeds a level of camaraderie that maybe the other boroughs don't have. We're all sort of tied into like a hustle culture here in the Bronx. That's how I always felt. That's how I always feel it anyway. You know, sometimes activities might not be as legal as they should be, but folks won't harass you as long as you're not committing violence against someone. So, you know, if you want to sell a pair of socks on the street, folks, so if you want to set up a fruit stand, go right ahead. If you want to give away free books on the corner, you know, no individual is harassing you that is not the right way to do things. Like everyone always feels in tune with the idea of you must hustle to pay your rent, to make a living, but just to be in community, you know, with your neighbors. Like everyone understands that, you know, New York City is a tough place to exist in.
Yeah.
And if we're going to exist in, you know, together in the Bronx, you have to really sort of be in tune with each other.
Yeah. People are doing their best to survive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
And so
Totally.
what was some of your favorite books during your childhood?
I used to read a lot of biographies, you know, when I was a kid. Just being a typical young boy, I was reading sports biographies a lot, about Jackie Robinson. I'm 62 now. The idols that I had growing up were like Jackie Robinson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Althea Gibson, Wilma Rudolph, a lot of athletes that were just sort of making their way into popular culture.
Okay.
So this is like the 70s, and we're not so far removed from the civil rights movement. So a lot of athletes were leading those causes and leading those demonstrations, both on the field and off the field. And I was just always attracted by how different athletes sort of, one, excelled in their sports, but also were making statements about who they were as humans, and you know, this sort of American narrative that existed for so long that, you know, the Black athlete, or you should just shut up and play. You know, the Black athlete was really starting to challenge that, you know, in the 60s into the 70s. So yeah, I was always attracted to biography growing up.
Which one of those biographies do you believe had the biggest impact on your life?
Gale Sayers Gale Sayers was a football player. He was a running back. He played for the Chicago Bears. And his biography was I Am Third, that, you know, God is first, his family and friends are second, and he is third. And he just spoke about, you know, growing up in the South and the challenges that he faced, one, you know, as a young person, but also then trying to make his way into the NFL. And the interesting thing about him, there's a couple of things. Your audience will probably remember him from Brian's Song. There was a movie called Brian's Song where there's these two athletes. One is Black, Gale Sayers, and the other is white, Brian Piccolo. And Brian Piccolo dies of cancer. And the story is about their friendship and the fact that Brian subsequently dies. And he speaks about that in his book. The whole idea of, again, going back to, you know, how Black athletes are presented with humanity. I felt like, you know, even at a young age, it had registered to me that what he was trying to say through his writings, but also through his life, was that, you know, you work hard, you face your obstacles, and you might succeed. But the most important thing is that, one, you try really hard, but two, you also face your obstacles through life as you know, sort of become an older teen, then a man. You know, most of us will not become professional athletes, but the same tenets can apply to your life. That, you know, you go to school, you play hard, you live your life the best you can, and good things will come to you. But also for him, if you keep God, centered in your life, and you also keep your family centered in your life.
Do you remember who wrote that biography?
He did. So it's like I'm pretty sure it's an autobiography.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I would have to double check that, but I'm pretty sure it was.
And what was the title again called?
I Am Third.
I Am Third. I've heard of that person with the name G. You said Gary?
Gail Sayers.
Gail Sayers. I've heard of that name, but I've never heard of this book. I've never heard of it.
A lot of people probably know the movie Brian's Song. So if any of your viewers just can, do a quick Google search.
When would that movie have been produced?
Well,
decades ago.
I'm dating myself. Yeah, it's from the 70s.
Okay, so I've never.
Sorry.
Never heard of any of what you just mentioned.
I apologize, but it's a great movie. I'm sure you can stream it somewhere on YouTube.
I'll have to check it out now. I will definitely have to check it out now.
Yeah.
This is a story about two men. They competed for the same job. One was white, the other black. One liked to talk a lot.
You said, uh-huh.
The other was shy as a 3-year-old.
Hey, rookies got to stick together.
Our story is about how they came to know each other, fight each other.
I'm going to whip you, Sayers. But you got to be at your best.
And help each other.
I think I owe you a beer.
I owe you a lot more than that.
Yeah.
What it comes down to is that JC had a notion here, and Ed seems to think it's a good idea.
We'd like you and Brian Piccolo to room together.
You had me worried. I thought it was something really.
This is something really. Man, you're talking about a white man and a black man rooming together on a team that's never been done before.
What JC is saying is that there may be some pressures, severe ones.
I was afraid to get up. I figured not everything was going to come with me.
You have never seen anyone so black and blue in your life.
It's like a rooming with a colored player again.
Gail told the joke.
Gail, I'm sending Brian Piccolo back to Chicago. He's always been in shape, willing to give 100%. But he's not doing that anymore. And that's what worries me. I don't know what it is. Could be something physical, or it might be an emotional disturbance.
I mean, I know perfectly well what's wrong with me. Gail, I think I'm pregnant.
Don't make fun of me, Brian. I'm scared.
I'm no idiot. This thing I got's bad, I know that. But, well, it's just a detour, Joy. I'm not gonna let it stop me. I'm just not. There's no way.
The tough, tender, and true story of Gail Sayers and Brian Piccolo.
And this is going back towards the Bronx. Which book do you believe best exemplifies the nature of the Bronx?
That's a tough, oh boy.
That's a tough question?
That is a tough question. Like when I think of books, I don't think so much in terms of books that reflect the Bronx itself. Let me think on that question. No book is coming to mind.
Mm-hmm.
There's a book called, again, you have to remember I was born in the 60s. There's a book called Down These Mean Streets by Pity Thomas, who was a Latino poet, mainly in Spanish Harlem, but the book itself sort of reflected that kind of hard scrabble life that a lot of people in the Bronx also led. Spanish Harlem is relatively close to the South Bronx. So a lot of people
Right.
who live in Spanish Harlem also oftentimes find themselves in the Bronx and vice versa. But he just talks about growing up young and poor, and as a young person dealing with the neighborhood and all those dynamics, but then getting older and being a part of those dynamics. He becomes a drug user. People around him start to die. And I don't want to equate those sort of negative things with being in the Bronx, but I think like his reality really reflected wholly on what the Bronx was like when I was younger. For a lot of people now, it's a different place. But when I was younger, it was a way tougher. People think the Bronx is beautiful now, and compared to, what it was like pre 1990.
Well, when you were a kid, the Bronx was burning, correct?
The Bronx was burning. Yeah, I was, 60s and 70s. I saw fires like not every day, but every week. And if you think about that, if you think about how you live your life personally now, Nahshon, if you saw a fire, if you saw a building burning every week, it would make an impact on you, because these buildings they're not like off in the distance, they're down the block, they're around the corner.
It's your community.
Yes, it's absolutely your community, but it's also the people who are now, burned out of those buildings. Like, what happens to them? Like, what are their, issues that they will now have to face and deal with, now that they are homeless? I mean, we have a homeless problem now, but can you imagine just like not that you're only homeless, but all of your possessions have, also gone up in flames, and possibly a life has been lost or affected.
So my next question was going to be, throughout our lives, we encounter challenging periods that may vary in intensity from person to person. Have you come across a particular book, if any, that aided you in navigating those difficulties and overcoming them? And it sounds like
that book,
Down These Mean Streets, was...
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was a really important book for me. Another book was Man Child in the Promised Land by Claude Brown. Again, it was a similar book that spoke about like this sort of hardship and strife of growing up. I believe his book is set in Harlem. But again, it's the same issues. He's a Black man. Pity Thomas was a Afro-Latino man. Other books, of course, again, all these books have a redemptive arc to them, where they start out like really sort of hard scrapple and gritty, but in the end, the protagonist or the antagonist becomes a more saved, in quotes, heroic figure. In that line is the autobiography of Malcolm X. We all know, his story, the story of Malcolm X, how he grew up in the South and what he overcame to become an important civil rights figure. So probably those three books I could like quickly reference in my head. Yeah.
Who was introducing you to this type of literature when you were just a kid?
The library.
You were just
the library. Yeah, and other friends and family. I had older cousins who were reading books also. So, when you're young and you're a reader, you'll basically sit down and read anything for a little while. And good books tend to stick with you. And even if you don't have the opportunity to like fully analyze, or you don't even have the faculties as a young person to fully analyze what you're reading, the subject matter and the title stay with you, and you come back. All of these books I came back to like later on in life, like as a teenager or as a young adult. So it is not like you're 8 years old, you read Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X, and your life has changed. But you remember, and you go back and you go back and you revisit, again and again, until you get out of books what you really need. Because sometimes we're not even, when we first read something, we're not ready for what that book is offering to us. We have to mentally be in a place where the book will make more sense to us. So.
Yeah. I think I have a book on my hands like that.
Okay.
Well, not think, I know I do. And how and when did you discover, or how were you introduced to James Baldwin?
Again, just, I was that person who's always walking, not as a kid, but definitely as a young adult.
As a young adult.
Just listening to other people, what they were talking about, who they were reading, going into bookstores without a plan, so that I'm looking at every book maybe not every book on the shelf, but I'm open to exploring different books. I'm open to feeding my curiosity, because James Baldwin is one of those people you hear about, whether it is in visual media, whether it's in school, because I don't recall in high school even hearing too much about James Baldwin. And when I was in high school, this is the 70s. So, James Baldwin.
You wouldn't have.
I would not have known him, but he was already around. Like all of his sort of, his monumental works had already been written. So, they were there. I just didn't know about them.
If you were to have a child, which book would you recommend to them, and what would be your reasoning behind it?
I mean, definitely all the 3 books that I just recommended.
All of those 3
books. I read a book called Billy by Albert French, which I love. There's so many books. The 1619 Project, I think, is just so important. I read another book recently, The Color of Law, by Richard Rothstein. And it really sort of breaks down systemic racism and how the American government set up laws. Because a lot of people think like racism is this sort of amorphous, intangible thing that you can't see unless somebody calls you out your name. Correct. But in actuality, racism was written into the laws of the United States of America. And that's one of the reasons why the wealth disparity exists even to this day, because we could not get federal housing loans the same way that white people could.
Or what was it, the GI Bill?
Or the GI Bill, exactly. We were not allowed to take advantage of the opportunities that the GI Bill offered. Banks were allowed to legally redline communities so that they didn't have to lend to certain people. Or if they did, they lent at such a high interest rate that it became tough for people who were loaned money at those high rates to pay them off, to sort of elevate through life. So, you buy your starter home with a mortgage, you refinance it, you move on to something bigger and bigger, but Black people weren't given that opportunity in this country. So Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, and I don't know if a kid would read that or not, but to me, it's very important. A couple of people who have been writing for young people who I really find invaluable. Jason Reynolds, the work that he's been doing in the YA, the young adult arena around books, is just amazing to me. One, that he's so prolific, but two, he's, without shame, he's speaking directly to a demographic like young men. Anybody can read his books, but it feels like he's writing for young men when I say young, like tweens, teens. I think he's probably one of the most important people you could read right now. And the other guy, his name is escaping me, but he's written these anti-racist books. Kahinde, I cannot fully remember his name.
I know who you're talking. Yeah, I know who you're talking about. I think Abrams.
I think that's how you pronounce it. But he's partnered with other people like Nick Stone, who's also a young adult writer. He's partnering with other people so that younger people can also read his books. Ibram Kendi is his name.
Okay.
So yeah, and that feels so important to me because he is writing for young adults, or he's partnering with other writers who can make his work accessible to younger people. Like when I was young, we didn't have books like this, but also, these partnerships that are forming around Black identity, or, many identities now, is just so important to what America might become if it sort of gets out of its own way.
Which book would you describe as the least appealing or enticing book that you've read over your past 50 years?
So I don't know what's the least enticing. I do find, religious dogma problematic. People who write from a religious perspective but is dedicated to marginalizing people, I find those books probably most problematic. I tend not to read them because of that. But anyone who's writing, religious dogma, where they're not accepting of whether it is your race, your gender, your other religions, I try to avoid those kinds of books.
Okay. Yeah. And who is your favorite author? Or who are your favorite authors?
Yeah, the author that sort of led me down this path. So I was working through the 90s, I was working regular jobs. I was always a reader, but I was working like, office work in hospitals and things like that. And I read a book called Billy by Albert French, is a book about a 10-year-old boy that kills a 14-year-old girl, a 10-year-old Black boy who kills a 14-year-old white girl. And it's based on a true story, somewhat based on a true story. And this young boy is sentenced to death as a 10-year-old. And it was just a book. I happened to go into a bookstore, found it on the bookshelf. I don't know if so many people have read the book, but I wanted other people to read this book. And so that desire led me to start a website called mosaicbooks.com, which no longer exists, but it was the first website dedicated to Black literature. And this is 1996. So we're talking, there's no social media, there's barely an internet. And that website kind of kept me on this path of being in the literary field. I have no advanced degrees in literature or English or, in that area of that field of study. I just really liked this book and wanted other people to read it. So that was probably one of the more important books that, authors that I really liked. I just read a few Toni Morrison books recently. So, what Toni Morrison is doing to document what I would call the American experience is probably unparalleled. The idea that the entire experience could be told from the perspective of Black people, and not just told from the perspective of Black people, but understood that Black people, that these narratives are the center of the American narrative, that without Black people in this country probably would not exist.
No doubt at all. And apart from your residence and places like libraries or literary events, where else do you enjoy reading books at?
Well, now that we have Kindles and we have audiobooks, I mean, I enjoy reading books at home more than anything because it's sort of peaceful here, but I will read or listen to books anywhere now. And I'm always either reading, and actually more and more, I'm starting to listen to books just so I can take advantage of that time I have, whether I'm commuting or I'm waiting for something, I'm waiting for an appointment, I'm walking through the streets, different things like that. And I'm admitting that I listen to books, but I don't refer to that as listening to books. I refer to that as reading. So whether I am looking at a physical book with pages, or whether I'm listening to it, or whether I'm looking at a Kindle, I consider all of it reading.
I don't want to butcher it. Ta-Nehisi Coates?
Ta-Nehisi Coates?
Ta-Nehisi Coates. Heard him speak at Toni Morrison's memorial in November of 2019. Yeah, before the pandemic.
Yeah.
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yeah.
He was protesting at a library. One of his books was banned. It was in the news today, but I can't find the link. Did you hear about it?
I did not hear about it. No, I'll definitely follow up.
I was Googling his name. One of his books is banned.
Maybe The Beautiful Struggle Between the World and Me. I mean, he has quite a few books out now. But that's like the tenor of the country that we're in right now, that people think that banning books is a solution to racism. Like no one, or that side of the argument that wants to ban books, they don't want to talk about racist issues in this country, but they want to ban books that they believe are racist, or that sort of perpetuate division. And we don't want to talk about it. We just want to be completely separate from ideas. And it's just not we had a president, of the United States who was duly elected that didn't read, didn't want to read, discouraged people from reading. And I don't think in the history of this country, we've ever had a person, the most powerful person in the country, if not the world, be so aligned with ignorance, and this is just the reverberations from having like a president like that.
This year, Ron DeSantis, he started book banning in Florida, various schools and universities. On May 15th at the New College of Florida, a liberal arts school, he signed a bill banning public colleges in the state from using funds on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. As a literary activist, you're committed to creating spaces that help leverage the power of books, culture, and education. My question was going to be, what are your thoughts on DeSantis book banning and blocking funds for DEI? And you kind of just...
Yeah, I mean, I just spoke on it. It is crazy. What's equally concerning is, so Ron DeSantis, he's the governor of a state. As much power as he has, the majority of people in Florida voted for him. So, it's not as though he's some sort of, loner, living in a cabin trying to ban books. He's the governor of a large state. The majority of people knew his politics going into it. And they still said, you know what?
He's our man.
He's our man. He's going to ban books, but he'll cut our taxes. And that's more important than our children getting a decent, education. So we're getting what we are voting or not voting for.
Yeah. And you mentioned your previous work, and you had mentioned Mosaic Books briefly. At what point in your life did you determine that you would embark on a career in the arts and culture?
Yeah. I started down this path in the mid-90s. I left my job in 99. Then I was working at New York Hospital doing sort of office work, building in collections. And when I left my job, I told myself that I would not work in an office again, that I would only work in the arts. Didn't have a clue as to how I would get a job, even though I had already started a literary magazine called Mosaic. It was not making money, as most literary magazines do not make money.
Right.
And we all have rent to pay. So what I did was I sent my resume to the Bronx Museum cold. There was no job opening. Nobody suggested I send it to them. They read it, and they invited me in for an interview. And the next thing, like 2 weeks later, I was working at the Bronx Museum.
And so that was your first job in the arts and culture?
Yeah, that was my first paying job. I had already started a literary magazine, but that was my first paying job in arts and culture.
What was your experience like working for the Bronx Council on the Arts in 2007? You consulted on literary and new media projects?
Yeah. You know, all of my jobs in the arts have been like perfect. You know, on the one hand, it's always felt like a fair trade. You know, on the one hand, whether it is the Bronx Council on the Arts or the Bronx Museum or En Foco, on the one hand, I'm giving them knowledge. You know, I'm bringing all of my life experiences to these organizations to benefit them. But also, I'm taking a lot from them. You know, I'm learning a lot from all of these organizations, whether it has to do with, you know, writing grants or, you know, personnel and staffing, you know, just how we value art in general. I think that it becomes this sort of ecosystem when you commit yourself to working in the arts, but you also commit yourself to not just taking, but also giving. Anybody who's worked in the arts knows you give way more than you're reimbursed for financially. Those jobs require a lot of time, a lot of effort. But to me, those are the best jobs. Those are the most rewarding jobs, you know? So yeah. So I always benefit from working in the arts, no matter who I'm working for.
In 1996, you launched Mosaic Books, the oldest continuously running website dedicated to books by people of the African diaspora until it was closed in 2014.
Yes.
What inspired you to establish Mosaic Books?
It was that singular book, Billy, by Albert French. I mean, I was reading a lot of different books at the time, and I did want to share them with other people. But that book by Albert French really kind of set me on my path. And it, you know, it's interesting, like we take for granted now, like WordPress and Squarespace and Wix, all of these different platforms that you can use to launch a website. None of those existed when I started. So I had to teach myself coding. So that took a little bit, you know, it was a lot of question and answers going on back and forth, a lot of trial and error. But once I got it down, the second challenge was, how do I pay for it? And a few years, and it was going for a while. So I started in 96. Then about 2001 is, before to maybe 99, I heard about PayPal. PayPal was just starting. And that gave me a way to collect money so that people could pay to have their books featured. And that gave me the means to collect money, which was like the most important thing. That was like the crucial element, because I had to find a way to pay for everything that I was doing.
Right.
That sort of gave me an in to sustainability, just, you know, making that website sustainable. Until 2014, by then, so a lot of my customers were self-published customers, writers, but around 2014 is when social media really started to take off. And a lot of people felt like they could do their own marketing. So I closed the website because people weren't paying to market their books. Everyone felt that they could market their own books.
And I'm going to read a quote. You were in an interview with AALBC, Troy. And this was a comment that you had made to him. It didn't dawn on me that so many years later, that little list that I started, Oprah would be reposting and it would be appearing all over the country, if not the world. Even now, when I think about it, that no one had a list before me, it just seems so like unbelievable. Even though there was a Black book community, you know, we have to remember. How did you feel when you discovered that Oprah was reposting and sharing your list of book recommendations?
You know, so if I can go back a little bit. So I started the website in '96 and I was looking to add content to the website.
Okay.
So I started listing different books. I started to build a database of different bookstores, bookstores, Black-owned bookstores, and Black book clubs. It was those lists that Oprah later on reposted. And you know, it's so funny because the reason why Troy brings that up, because he, in the late '90s, he asked me to repost it. And I was like, yeah, go ahead, no problem. Like, I didn't want to commodify everything. You know, it felt like everyone knowing how to get to a Black bookstore was more important than me trying to charge people for that information. I just wanted people to support Black bookstores.
Right.
And the fact that later on, years later, Oprah and the New York Times and all these different outlets would repost that list. I'm just like, yeah, I'm cool with it. I'm absolutely cool that I can even contribute to like this larger narrative that didn't exist, you know, before mosaicbooks.com. So yeah, no, it's a good feeling. It's a good feeling.
Wow. In an interview with African American Literature Book Club, you were talking with Troy and you said the way you presented online, you were like, you know, kindred spirits. Personally, I just was happy to talk, shocked to talk to somebody that would understand what the heck I'm doing, right? Because most people, I couldn't talk to them about what I was doing on the web. Even to this day, that remains true.
So this is the late '90s. I started mosaicbooks.com, and Troy has started a different website called the African American Literature Book Club, AALBC.com. We didn't know each other, but we connected online. So Troy discovered that list of bookstores and wanted to repost it to his website. And I said, sure, go ahead, no, not a problem. And that's how Troy and I became friends. It turns out that Troy and I graduated from the same high school the same year. We graduated together in 1980. We did not know each other. It wasn't until the late '90s that through our websites that we met each other and we became really good friends. One of the jokes I used to tell Troy is that John Johnson, who was the founder of Ebony magazine, and I don't know if this is a true quote or not, but you know, he's attributed as saying, like, you know, my people don't want to read on the web, like my people want to read paper. So when Troy and I met, we were in a unique space. There weren't many Black people designing, not just designing, but owning their own websites. So that's why Troy and I sort of became kindred spirits in the fact that really early on, we could share information and ideas about what it means to, what it means to just exist in a digital space, but also to, you know, tackle these sort of digital problems that come up, you know, when you're existing online.
How long did it take for you to master HTML?
I never did. But how long did it take me to get enough knowledge to just jump online? I don't know. I didn't study first, then start a website. I was studying as I was building a website. So I was doing both of these things at the same time. So there's no like, it's not like how you go to school for 4 years, go to college for 4 years, then you start a job. No, I was studying and doing it at the same time. So, yeah.
So how did you handle the challenge of feeling misunderstood by others regarding your project and its objectives, with some people continuing to lack understanding even to this day?
You know, I didn't worry about them. I just made a way. I just, both Troy and I, we became sort of evangelists early on for authors and publishers putting their books online. And we just stuck with that, and then there were other people involved, and, bigger companies started to get involved. Amazon popped up, and Barnes and Nobles had a website, of course, still do. But we were just early evangelists of what we believed in. Like, even though I had a print magazine, my real focus was the website. Because that's where I sort of generated income. But that's where I felt there was the most opportunity to reach the most people.
And you were selling books.
Yeah, and I'm selling books. For the average person, the internet felt like it was your best bet if you wanted to reach a wide audience.
And so you're the visionary behind the Literary Freedom Project. It's a nonprofit arts organization dedicated to promoting the literary arts through education, fostering creative thinking, and embracing new media. What objectives does the organization strive to achieve?
We're trying to, create spaces, again, like to kind of go back to a couple of questions ago about Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump, not wanting people to read, because reading builds conversations. Conversations build better understanding about who we are and our differences. We can come together. I read something, you read something. We can find like this middle place where we can discuss these ideas. And that's what the Literary Freedom Project tries to do. We try to build physical spaces, whether it is in a library or a gallery or a museum, a local retail store. We go into these spaces and we have conversations about books, but it's not just about books. It's about the ideas that are in books. That's the most important thing. So how it works is the first week we meet, we invite everybody to come together, and it's free and open to the public. Anybody can join us. And we invite people, come in, we give everybody a book. And then we tell them over the next 4 weeks, we're gonna meet in the same location and discuss this same book. But again, you don't even have to have read the book to be a part of the conversation. If you know about racism or gentrification or queer identity or politics, you can join the conversation. So we're trying to create spaces where people can sort of come together and just share ideas and have conversations in an adult space. So most of our participants are.
The club is bringing Bronxites together one book at a time each and every month.
A Bronx-based nonprofit called the Literary Freedom Project is behind the One Book One Bronx book club that creates a space for those in the Bronx that want to gather and discuss issues affecting their community while meeting weekly to discuss that month's book. Best of all, they say the sessions are free for all to join.
The people who come here to come together to talk about books and reading, they want to talk about the Bronx. They want to talk about the economic issues, the racial issues, the gentrification issues, and that's what we do through a book club. The book that we read is actually just the foundation for conversations.
Well, the club, which began meeting in October of 2018, averages 40 attendees per meeting and has distributed over 200 free books.
So suppose Trump and DeSantis were presented with a critical decision: either read a thought-provoking book on African-American culture or face dire consequences, death. Which book would you recommend for them to read and compose an essay on reflecting their newfound knowledge?
So one, I think they would choose death over reading. But I think the 1619 Project has really crystallized this history, the travesty and tragedy around the slave trade and what it has meant to this country and the ongoing ramifications, to racism, this sort of separate but equal feeling that it feels like we still have. Like, white folks want to be separate, they don't mind Black people having rights, but they just don't want them to be like, I don't know. They don't want our history to be equal to their history. Again, there is no America without Black people. We were brought.
There's no world without Black people. No universe.
Our sole purpose, why we were enslaved, was to build this country. That's the only reason we were enslaved. I mean, later on, the enslaved African had a value that was greater than the work they contributed to building this country. But initially, the African was brought here to till the land, to chop the tree, to farm, to build buildings, to do all of this hard labor in the sun that white people could not do.
Would not do.
Would not and could not do. I mean, I think it's important to say that, because all of these white people who initially came over to this country were not aristocracy. So they weren't people of means who didn't work in the countries where they came from. Mm-hmm. They all came here and realized that, if I can just clear that entire 10 acres, I can build a farm, I can sell my product. Mm-hmm. But they could not do that by themselves. Right. The land was too harsh. The weather was unrelenting, the sun. So they enslaved the continent, or, people of a continent. So I think the 1619 project in its entirety is just the book, the articles, is just so important.
In 1998, the Literary Freedom Project launched Mosaic Literary Magazine, a print triannual that explores the literary arts by writers of African descent and features interviews, essays, and book reviews. Tell us more about Mosaic Magazine and the writers who've been featured.
Yeah. Mosaic, again, was started out of Mosaic Books. So once I started mosaicbooks.com, I decided to start a literary magazine that was not about marketing. So mosaicbooks.com was about selling books, marketing books. Mosaic Literary Magazine really looked at literature from a critical standpoint. We printed essays and book reviews and author interviews. Again, the whole idea is just to provide a platform for all of these different writers, Marlon James, Colson Whitehead, Colin Channer. We interviewed Sonia Sanchez, Nikki Giovanni, all these different writers, just to have a platform to discuss, their books, their ideas through interviews, to look at their books critically through book reviews, but also to invite different writers in to write essays about literature or other subjects. So those are some of the people we interviewed early on.
Mitchell Jackson, Lucille Clifton, Bernice McFadden, Walter Mosley, Tiffany Unique, Stacey Ann Chin, Tahimba Jess. Your first interview was with Jessica Care Moore, correct?
Yeah, she was in our first issue. Yeah. She had just won I think she had just won the Apollo. And yeah, she was just a young poet in Brooklyn. So we reached out to her. She was a friend of a friend, I believe. And Lynn Johnson did the interview.
I'm going to read a quote. The original idea was to start like this little 8-page brochure that would be free. People could pick it up when they walked into the store. And then I was really inspired by African Voices magazine and what they were doing, Carolyn Butts, and I decided to give it a shot to do a full magazine. And that's what came out of it. But yeah, that definitely inspired by African Voices magazine, to a lesser extent, QBI Quarterly, Black Review also, and then within a few other magazines that were popping up here and there.
Yeah, I was already in a community, and that community, it felt like there was a lot going on at the time around new Black imprints at publishing houses. There was this growing spoken word scene happening, particularly in Brooklyn, partially in Harlem and the Bronx.
Poetry slams.
Poetry slams, exactly. I mean, Jessica Care Moore came out of that whole system. It felt like there was just so much going on at the time that what I could contribute to it was this literary magazine, which again, the initial idea was that it would be a small sort of brochure, and it morphed into a full-fledged magazine. In about 2018, we actually went on hiatus, and now we're coming back as a print magazine. So this year, actually next month, we'll return as an annual print publication, plus have the website, mosaicmagazine.org.